Hey there. You're now listening to Felix firing off from afar for the flyover, sixth installment. This is Felix, and I'm going to talk today about the great American revolutionary Grace Lee Boggs. Boggs was born in 1915 to Chinese immigrant parents, and Boggs died Monday, October 5th, at the age of 100. And there was a particularly good article that I read by Karen Aguilar San Juan titled "We Are Extraordinarily Lucky to Be Living in These Times," which is a direct quote from Boggs. And Aguilar San Juan provides extensive commentary on Boggs and her background and her thought. And then there's also in that article a transcript of an interview that the author did with Grace Lee Boggs. And so if you're interested in checking that article out, you should email the Flyover Info Shop, info@flyoverinfoshop.org, or you can call the WDBX station during Counterpower After Hours, wherein Felix's firing off segment should air. The phone number to the station there is 618-457-3691. Or, of course, you can stop by the Flyover Info Shop at 214 North Washington there in Carbondale, Illinois. I hear it's quite the happening place now that Felix has left. That's all that was necessary, I suppose, was for my presence to disappear, for it to really start popping off. Well, you're welcome, everybody. You now only hear me firing off from afar, from hundreds of miles away, but I'm sure you still appreciate that. And so, on to Grace Lee Boggs. I'll be drawing heavily from the Karen Aguilar San Juan commentary. So, Boggs was born in an apartment above her father's Chinese-American restaurant in Providence, Rhode Island, and her family moved to New York in 1924. She would later earn a doctorate in philosophy. She actually considered intellectual work a key part of her activism, and activism for Boggs wasn't typically the type castigated by anarchists because of its implications about appeals to existing structure of authority to be nicer. But instead, activism, as she conceived it, was focused on reclaiming individual and collective agency through mutually empowering political engagement, and more on that in a bit. But she didn't apply her intellectuality to the university after obtaining the doctorate, which I think is really interesting. Instead, she focused on raising consciousness, one through promoting and speaking to exemplars of direct action, but also explicitly theoretical work. She, for example, held a Power of Ideas reading group in Detroit's Cass Corridor, and more on her move to Detroit in a moment too. But first, it's worth noting that her emphasis on ideas, with serious attention still to material conditions, echoes what critical theorist Herbert Marcuse termed the idealistic core of dialectical materialism. That is, our human capacity to imaginatively and creatively project at the level of ideas beyond our existing material conditions so as to inform our action, to alter those conditions, humanize them and the world, if you will. And so Grace Lee Boggs moved to Chicago in 1940. She was a collaborator with the great Marxist scholar C.L.R. James, and James informed her conceptions of revolution. She moved to Detroit in 1953 and married James Boggs. That was around the time that she broke away from Trotskyism in the 1950s. And her husband emphasized study of how capitalism's dynamic and destructive change is key to understanding the world that we live in if we want to change it. With their home city of Detroit, what was being converted into a deindustrialized wasteland as case in point. And of course now Detroit is a hotbed for revolutionary activity from below. And it's certainly not inaccurate to point to Boggs' influence in that direction. And so Boggs also advanced a dialectical humanist approach quite explicitly. It's the reason she's been called an Emersonian Marxist. She emphasized the humanity of the working class and the political sphere as opposed to the economically reductive facets of struggle that she would suggest were emphasized within more orthodox Marxism. And I'll speak to that in a second, but first of all, who does this remind us of? For me, I made the immediate connection, the break from Trotskyism, and then the emphasis on the political sphere, very much like Murray Bookchin. There was an article by Federico Venturini at Roar Magazine, which is available online, published back in February, titled Bookchin, Living Legacy of an American Revolutionary. And it makes the case for also considering Murray Bookchin as an archetypal and much needed revolutionary in the United States, much like Boggs has been appropriately cast. And just to flesh out some of those parallels and similarities between their political theory and thought. So Murray Bookchin's social ecology, which has been discussed on the Counterpower After Hours and the Counterpower After Hours and the Counterpower Radio Hour quite extensively before, but his social ecology and his dialectical naturalism, as he termed it, really advanced a humanist ethic and combining of theory and action that recognizes that humanity emerged from nature, from the natural world, yet while humans are a part of nature, they are also distinct from it. There's something that can be identified as human within the natural world, and that distinction has been cause for some destruction, yes, as Bookchin would readily admit, but part of that distinction is also for Bookchin our shared capacity to rationally and critically assay our situation in order to transform it along more ecological lines. And his ideas for doing that included communalism. There are notes in the essay The Communalist Project, which is published in the newly and posthumously released book by Bookchin, The Next Revolution, Popular Assemblies, and the Promise of Direct Democracy. And Marina Citrin, theorist of horizontalidad, who's written quite a bit based on her fieldwork in Argentina in the wake of the economic crisis in 2001 and the movements of direct democracy that emerged after that. And then also Marina was involved in Occupy Wall Street. She's called the Bookchin book that I just referenced one of the most important books for thinking about revolution in our time. And so in that book, Bookchin, he notes that he initially considered communalism to be encompassed within anarchism, but then later he realized that it was its own distinct set of political theory and action. And I suppose that's something that anarchists and self-identifying communalists can deliberate and debate and consider going forward. And so Bookchin also, along with communalism, or what could be considered encompassed by communalism, was his program of libertarian municipalism, which basically called for popular assemblies for decision making. It really put forward an emphasis on direct democracy to recover agency. And there was a recent Crime Think feature, which Felix had mentioned in a previous section when he fired off. The title of that feature was Understanding the Kurdish Resistance, and the Crime Think authors discuss the Kurdish struggle in Turkey and Syria, the latter where the Rojava Revolution is taking place in 3 autonomously self-governed cantons. And I'm going to read real quickly a quote from that Crime Think piece because I kind of want to break it down a little bit. So in a footnote, the author of the piece states, although Western leftists are fascinated by the Bookchin-Öcalan connection, it is not as if Kurdish militants are walking around with Bookchin under their arms in the region. Sure, democratic confederalism resembles libertarian municipalities, but pointing to Bookchin as the ideological forefather reeks of Eurocentrism. And so Abdullah Öcalan, the leader of the Kurdistan Workers' Party, who's been imprisoned since 1999, and I would, I guess, entreat Crime Think to think a little bit here and push themselves, because, I mean, it's pretty well documented that it is not just mere coincidental resemblance between democratic confederalism and libertarian municipalism. While yes, it would be extreme hyperbole to suggest that Bookchin was the forefather of the revolution in Rojava and democratic confederalism that's practiced there, but Öcalan had called himself a student of Bookchin's, was very much disappointed that he was unable to meet with Bookchin. By that time, Bookchin was rather old and wasn't in the best health, so the meeting never took place, although Bookchin expressed his solidarity with the Kurdish struggle. And Öcalan had read Bookchin extensively, and his ideas informed his own program of democratic confederalism that he outlined, which was then put into practice by the predominantly Kurdish population in the autonomous cantons that comprise Rojava, but also in Turkish Kurdistan, lesser known areas where it's less fully developed. And I think, instead of being dogmatic, it's important that we acknowledge that. But back to Bookchin and the Bookchin-Boggs connection. So both emphasize recovering political and cultural agency, but I'd underscore the importance of doing that in such a militant way that encroaches upon the power exerted by capital in the economic sphere that it constructs. So engaging in workplace struggles, takeovers when possible, creating solidarity economies, and working to evolve ourselves from the Homo economicus, the humans that capitalism has created, towards something less deplorable. That has to entail fighting to be less exploited, I think, within the capitalist system that so many people are still coerced into working within that paradigm. And so fighting against that exploitation, I think, is still key. And this is not unlike Grace Lee Boggs' notion of place consciousness, and that is the idea that theories about social change must connect to needs of people in particular places. And the places where many people are still coerced into spending much of their time include capitalistic workplaces. And I think in many cases those are workplaces where most of the decisions that are being made are not being made by the majority of people who are subject to them. And there's also all sorts of surplus value extraction still goes on to get the classical Marxian analysis. In fact, it's probably more applicable now. And even more than that, I think the expansion of the service industries, well, yes, there's financial services, which has been important for the advent of monopoly finance capital, but there's also the huge growth in service industries and retail and fast food and all of that, with the kind of deindustrialization that you've seen in Midwestern cities like Detroit. And so I think making sure that people's needs are being met and working collectively to meet them, and doing that in such a way that refuses the extreme domination and exploitation that you see within the capitalist workplaces today is key. So back to Grace, and I don't think Grace would disagree, but back to the 21st century revolutionary for Grace revolved around a society of active subjects, constructing a society of active subjects, becoming a society of active subjects, sharing a common humanity. Again, that was key for her and also for Bookchin, and reclaiming agency individually and collectively through collective struggle toward higher emotional and political well-being, as the author of the article that I'm drawing from put it. And so Grace Lee Boggs wanted to transcend the production-oriented Marxism, according to the author, which is kind of like what Moss from the Counterpower Radio Hour and Counterpower After Hours says all the time. Think less about production. Moss, the consummate anthropologist, always sharing his anthropological insights on the air, which we appreciate. Another anthropologist of anarchist leanings, David Graeber, wrote an article a few years back titled Turning Modes of Production Inside Out. And he argues for not abandoning entirely the notion of modes of production, which is popular within Marxian theory analysis, but rather shifting focus to, among other things, how capitalism produces not just things, but also people, alienated, disgruntled, frustrated, and overworked people that are kept from realizing their full potential, I'd add. And so, to wrap this up, I just wanted to point to some of the other accomplishments that Grace Lee Boggs should be thankful for. So she had founded the Detroit-based Asian Political Alliance around 1970, but she was just as, if arguably much more involved in the black struggle throughout much of her life, thanks in part to her husband, and she more or less rejected doctrinaire identity politics, however, and I think that's an important point. She also more or less rejected postmodernism, insofar as that postmodern thought would entail a rejection of larger meta-narratives. In response to the postmodern critique, I think she'd point to, and did, unapologetically, advancing the struggle for our shared humanity. And that, I think, is what informs her penchant for the political, for a repoliticization along very different lines. And that's all Felix has for you this time. Again, I would encourage you to contact the Flyover Info Shop folks and those at the station who are hosting the Counterpower Radio Hour and Counterpower After Hours. You can email InfoShop, info@flyoverinfoshop.org. You can stop by the Info Shop, which is, again, located at 214 North Washington there in Carbondale. And if you'd like a copy of the article that Felix has been referencing throughout, which also includes a really good transcript of an interview with Grace Lee Boggs, then holler at the Flyover folks, and Felix will make sure that they can get the article to you. And again, you can call the WDBX station when this is airing. Give them a ring, 618-457-3691. And so, in lieu of Felix DJing and actually playing a song, he is going to kindly request that his friends and comrades on Counterpower After Hours play Truth Is by Brother Ali. If y'all can do that for Felix, it'd be much appreciated. And you all tune in next time for the next installment of Felix firing off from afar for the flyover.